Welcome. Welcome to Massey College. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here for what promises to be a very timely conversations about the Unwritten Constitution and its implications in our world of populist politics and polarization. Je veux vraiment vous accueillir tous et toutes. Ça me fait grand plaisir de vous avoir ici. On a bien hâte à cette discussion qui se promet d'être très engageante. I want to recognize that Massey College is built on Indigenous lands, the lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and it is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward this land and also the great privilege that we have to do our great work here today. And my first words before I pass the mic to Tom Axworthy is to thank him for creating, imagining this conversation that we're going to have. I am indebted to Tom for his ongoing work for Massey College over the last 3 years in putting forward some fascinating ideas for both our public policy issues and conferences, but also our ethics series, which he has been spearheading as well. Merci beaucoup, Tom. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Natalie, and good morning, all. And I want to also begin with thanks to the Massey staff for putting on the technical side of the policy forums. We, in our last set of discussions on the economy in November, there was such interest in it that the only strong critique is that it wasn't live streamed. So many other people wanted to attend. And so the folks have been hard at work, along with Howard Brown and David Slowly, to help make that happen so we can expand our audience. So we're delighted and begin with more thanks. On today's topic, oh yes. I just want to, I have been asked this morning and last night, the origins of this theme of the Unwritten Constitution. And I want to begin just with a little story because Dorothy Davey, who has been a friend of mine, and Keith, her husband, my political mentor for nearly 50 years, every year the Davies and the Axworthys would go to Stratford. And so this year, first time since COVID, Dorothy and I and Roberta were on the bus going to Stratford. Oh, Marcus, you're here, delighted. And on the way back, we, as one chats, be talking about populism and what Boris Johnson was then doing in the UK, and Orban in Hungary. Daniel Smith was then running for leader of the PCs, and she wanted to rip up the Constitution totally. And so as we talked about this and the issues of populism and how it affects the traditions and conventions of institutions, Dorothy said to me, you know, you should have a conference on this. So here we are. And I want to thank Dorothy for being the inspiration and the prod of this idea. So with the theme, as has been described in the outline of this conference, that if we think about constitutions governance, written constitutions, some societies don't have any. In ours, of course, we have the Charter and the Constitution Acts of 1867, the old BNA Act, and the Constitutional Patriation of 82. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a huge mass of conventions and traditions underneath that really set the rules of the game. And the preamble of our Constitution, 1867, says that we will have a Constitution similar to the principles of the United Kingdom. And about the time of just a little bit after the BNA Act, Gladstone, the Prime Minister of Britain, when being asked about the principles of the UK, said, our principles are unwritten. So it presumes good faith and good work on those who run the Constitution. So that's part of our issue today in the 21st century. Do we have the good faith and do we have the good work on that whole mass of conventions, rules, and traditions that are most of our political constitution? And just one final piece on the importance of conventions, one which I was personally part of, which was the great patriation debate in '81 with the Supreme Court ruling at a critical time in September of 1981 that what Mr. Pierre Trudeau's government was proposing by taking the Constitution was legal, but it was unconventional, that it was the conventions, without defining how many provinces had to agree, the Supreme Court said more than 2. And so the government was faced right away with, should it adhere to the convention as defined by the Supreme Court, which the Trudeau government did, and hence the negotiations with the premiers. And almost just a day or two after the Supreme Court ruling, in a discussion I had with Mr. Trudeau, there was no question in his mind that those conventions had to be followed. And therefore, somewhat at the time, we developed the idea of a national referendum, if necessary, and had that in our pocket when we went to meet with the premiers. But just an illustration how critical this convention was, but also a government that adhered to it. So that's the issue before us today. We'll hear about the importance of the Unwritten Constitution, and then we'll look at what traditions and conventions still are relevant and are under threat. Do we have the good faith and the good work to make our unwritten Constitution continue to work for us? And now I want to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Carolyn Tuohy, who's Professor Emeritus at the Munk School, one of Canada's foremost public policy experts. Just before COVID, she published a book on reform of the healthcare system. I think we need an update now, Carolyn, after COVID. And a dear friend, senior fellow at Massey, and also my co-advisor to our student group of the Gordon Symposium, which is a student-led policy conference. And March 24th, some of our student colleagues are here today. Massey and Munk will be sponsoring the 2023 Gordon Symposium on energy security, transition, and attack on national security. So I'm delighted that Carolyn is here to moderate our panel, and look forward to working with her and our students on our next session, which will be in March 24th. So thank you very much, Carolyn.
To chair this panel. I'm absolutely delighted to be here this morning. Congratulations to those who inspired and organized this extremely timely and important discussion. As a political scientist, my go-to definition of institutions comes from my colleague Kathy Phelan at MIT, who defines an institution as a set of collectively enforced expectations that govern behavior. And I think this morning we will hear, and throughout the day, we'll hear about what has been happening to those mechanisms of collective enforcement that underpin our democratic institutions. And we have an inspired panel. Again, congratulations to the organizers, bringing together a group of experts from different perspectives. We were talking at coffee about the importance of different perspectives to bear on any issue of import. Let me just introduce our panelists in the order in which they will speak. Each of them will speak for about 20 minutes. I will be draconian in enforcing that. And then we will have some time for questions, both from those who are here in person, and if there are questions online, I will take some of those as well. So let me first introduce Vanessa Macdonald is an associate professor in the Faculty of Law, the Common Law Division, and at the University of Ottawa, and is co-director of the U Ottawa Public Law Centre. She researches in the areas of Canadian constitutional law, constitutional theory, comparative constitutional law, and law. She holds JD, from the University of Toronto and an LLM from Harvard. Vanessa's research examines the constitutional functions of the executive branch, interinstitutional relations, and the role of social movements in the development of constitutional law. She is currently completing a SSHRC-funded research project on quasi-constitutional legislation. I hope we hear a bit more of that. Vanessa has also written extensively about police powers and the jury. She is, like all of the panelists actually, she is a regular media commentator, in her case on criminal and constitutional issues. And then next we will hear from Marcus Kolga, who is an international award-winning documentary filmmaker, journalist, digital communicationist, and a leading Canadian expert on Russian and Central and Eastern European issues. Marcus's focus is on communication and media strategies as tools of foreign policy and defense. And he continues to write commentary for national and international media, including the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star. He is the co-founder and publisher of upnorth.eu, an online magazine that features analysis and political and cultural news from the Nordic and Baltic regions. He frequently comments on Russian, Eastern, and Central European issues on North American radio and television and at foreign policy conferences. He's involved as well with international human rights organizations and national political organizations. And finally, Erin Kelly is president and CEO of Advanced Symbolics Incorporated, or ASI, a company that uses artificial intelligence to improve market research and polling accuracy. Erin has over 20 years of experience as a marketing executive, most recently as chief operating officer of a large advertising firm. And today, she's a pioneer in the new world of marketing research using AI. She's a veteran practitioner of traditional market research techniques such as focus groups, telephone surveys, quantitative and qualitative research, but now she is a strong advocate of using AI for much more accurate and cost-effective market research. And she is a regular contributor to TVO, CBC News, the Globe and Mail, iPolitics, The Hill Times, Policy Magazine, and Entrepreneur Magazine, educating marketers on the latest technologies and how they can benefit from them. So from a rich variety of perspectives, we're going to be addressing one of the key questions of our sets of questions of our time. I very much look forward to hearing from each of the panelists, and we'll start with Vanessa.
Great. Well, so thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Tom for having me here today. And I have to say, I don't think I could have asked for a better setup in terms of these two sets of reflections about the topic that we're going to be discussing today. And what I'd like to do in my 20 minutes as the first presenter today is to hopefully set the stage a little bit for the discussion that we have by talking about how I think this broad issue of populism, democratic decline, and the Unwritten Constitution, how this issue arises in the Canadian context, and what some of the possible solutions might be to the challenges that we're facing. I approach these issues primarily from a legal perspective, as I'm excited to have an interdisciplinary conversation today, because I do think that media and popular opinion are sort of playing very important roles in the way that these developments are proceeding. Okay. So I think until recently, the discussion of populism and democratic decline in Canada has been a largely academic conversation. There, of course, have been longstanding discussions about some of the frailties in our electoral system, problems with low voter turnout, concerns about executive dominance, strong party discipline, that kind of thing. But Relative to the state of affairs in other parts of the world, I think the perception has been that Canadian political institutions are really strong. I think it's fair to say, though, that the landscape has really shifted in the last couple of years, and that Canada is not immune from the kinds of democratic backsliding that we're seeing in many parts of the world. And I think this is an important point to make in situating the discussion we're having today, and that is that it's of course important for us to look at the way that these issues are presenting themselves in the Canadian context, but we also have to situate what's happening here in the context of wider global developments. And so this is a point that British political scientist Matthew Flinders makes in his research, that he's looking at democratic decline in the UK, and he says, if you look at what's happening with Brexit and those developments, in many ways they seem very particular to the UK, but to a surprising degree, those developments are also connected to broad international developments. And I think that's also true in Canada. And so in their 2022 report on democracy, International IDEA identified COVID-19, climate change, and armed conflicts as being important threats to the democratic order. And I think when we think about climate change or COVID, we sometimes don't think about the way that those forces can actually have an impact on our democracy. But I think recent events show the ways that they actually can. We also know that authoritarianism is spreading globally, and that this is arming politicians with new strategies for consolidating power, often in violation of existing constitutional norms. So one of my claims today is to say that the threats that Canadian democracy is facing today, they're both, the concerns are sort of local and global, but also that these threats are coming both from outside institutions and from within institutions as well. And so I think if we're going to understand the problems that we're facing, before we can talk about solutions, we first diagnose the problem. I think it's important for us to keep our eye on those different axes. So I'll just give you one example of this, which I think kind of reflects the complexity of the situation we're facing right now. This is just one example, but it's one that, if you lived in Ottawa, you lived through, as I did, and that's the convoy. And so almost exactly 1 year ago today, in early 2022, the Trudeau government declared a controversial national state of emergency after this truck convoy brought protesters into downtown Ottawa, and as well at the same time as key border crossings were blocked both in Ontario and Alberta. So ostensibly the protesters were there to because they were opposed to vaccine mandates, but there were also widespread racism and sexism and homophobia associated with the convoy. There were also concerns that the protesters were seeking to undermine Canada's democratically elected government. And so leaders in the convoy protest issued a manifesto where they sought to form government with the Governor General and the Senate. And it seems almost absurd to say this, but this is actually happened a year ago. And sometime later, a large cache of weapons was found at the home of some of the participants in the Alberta blockade. While all of this was happening, several politicians threaded the needle in expressing their support for the convoy. So on the one hand, they supported the convoy's mission or its message, but at the same time, they said that they were opposed to unlawful activity. And so, to me, this is a really illustrative example of the complexity of the situation that we face, right? On the one hand, you have these threats to constitutional democracy that are coming from outside of political institutions and that are part of larger global developments, right? Part of the larger sort of pandemic response, opposition to vaccine mandates, against equity-seeking groups, the threat of violent right-wing extremism, and the like. This is all part of something that's bigger than what was happening in Canada, in Ottawa, rather. But the response from the system is also something to be concerned about, right? This was the first time ever that a national state of emergency was declared under the Emergencies Act. And I'm not here today to comment on whether that declaration of emergency was lawful. The fact is that whenever the government declares a state of emergency that suspends the constitutional rights of a large swath of people, there's reason to be concerned. And this came out very strongly in an expert roundtable on fundamental rights that I was part of at the Rouleau Commission, this commission that's now inquiring into the declaration of the state of emergency. In addition, we see this problematic practice of politicians, some politicians saying, that they support the convoy's mission and the right to protest, but they don't support unlawful activity. But of course, this is a very difficult argument to make when the central figures in the convoy are issuing a manifesto where they're demanding to form government with the Governor General and the Senate, right? So, to me, this is what we're facing. And in many ways, the convoy seems like a moment in time, but there are also notable examples, I think, of these tensions flaring up, and I'll reference that briefly in a moment. So there's, two things here that I'd like to say to, get the conversation going today. So now I'm turning to what does the Unwritten Constitution have to do with all of this? And so the first point is, and here I'm drawing on U.S. scholar Jamal Green, and as he points out, some of the most important norms that hold our system together are unwritten, and that's a point that Tom has also made this morning. And these norms and principles depend on their enforcement on political actors, largely, rather than courts, right? And so what makes all of this so concerning, these current events that we're seeing, is widespread bad behavior among politicians when it comes to these unwritten norms and principles. Most of this bad behavior is the kind of thing you can go to court and seek a remedy for, right? So what am I talking about here? I'm not talking about violations of charter rights, because we know that you can go to court and hold the state accountable for these types of violations. I'm talking about things like changing the size of Toronto City Council in the middle of an election, invoking the notwithstanding clause in circumstances that are officially lawful, but which in the medium term degrade democratic values. So here I'm referring to the increasingly routine use of the notwithstanding clause by Ontario and Quebec to ensure that they can achieve their policy agenda without having to worry about the charter. And I'm talking about Doug Ford refusing to testify before the Rouleau Commission by invoking parliamentary privilege. And I've done some work on some of these issues with my colleague, Philippe Lagacé, who's a political scientist at Carleton. And so some of what I'm going to talk about now is work that we've produced together. So, in all of these circumstances, technically, politicians are permitted to invoke the notwithstanding clause or, refuse to testify the mission by invoking parliamentary privilege. But, on a deeper level, these actions show a disregard for the mechanisms that exist to ensure democracy and accountability in our constitutional order. And so, one of the lessons that we can take from abroad, from Poland and other jurisdictions, is that, this is actually, unfortunately, a common technique of authoritarian governments, is to use mechanisms that are superficially lawful to undermine constitutional democracy. And I think we have to take this seriously. I'm not seeking to be, alarmist, but we have to understand, some of these techniques come from the playbook of authoritarian governments. And, we don't want to wait until they're sort of blatant unconstitutionality or blatant disregard of the constitutional order in Canada before we start to talk about this. And so, I have difficulty, for example, with the argument that, the convoy protesters were just there exercising their right of peaceful assembly and, challenging that or critiquing that and critiquing the politicians who supported them, is ideological somehow. You just don't agree with, the message that they were there to offer. To me, look at that situation and I think those people were there to undermine our constitutional democracy. And the politicians who walked with them did real damage to fundamental constitutional norms. That's not ideological in my book. That's about, being attentive to what happens when we allow constitutional norms to be eroded, little by little, but unmistakably. And so I think, for scholars, this is really important. I think scholars have to attend to what's happening. And I think we have to, use our expertise to diagnose it as we see it. And for me, I think this is concerning. It's not about politics, but it's about respect for fundamental democratic norms. Okay, second and last point. And this is, again, draws us on some work that Phil and I have been doing, and these are very much thoughts that are still in progress. But, I think the point here, another point is, just because a constitutional matter falls within the remit of the political branches doesn't mean that there are no principles or values that structure political decision-making, right? Those norms might be unwritten, but a paper that Phil and I have coming out in this year, in 2023, in the Supreme Court Law Review, tries to make the argument that unwritten constitutional principles also guide political decision-making. These are the principles, the fundamental legal principles that undergird our constitutional order. They're principles like the rule of law, the separation of powers, democracy, judicial independence. They are the principles that make our Constitution what it is. To date, these principles have been largely understood as being legal principles that are applied by courts, but part of the argument that we're trying to make is that these principles, because they are what makes the Constitution what they are, they're also political principles, and they are principles that limit what governments can do in the political system. That, it's not, the political constitution is not just politics. And I think that there's, a strong argument to be made that that's the case. And so political actors really have a choice. There's right now this part of the Constitution that belongs to them, right? The political Constitution. This is the part of the Constitution that they're responsible for. And I think what we might see happen is, and again, this is based on some work that Phil and I have done, if they don't uphold these values in a meaningful way, I think there's every chance that we might start to see courts get more involved in enforcing the political constitution. That would be very controversial. But it's also what we're seeing happening in parts of the world that are experiencing democratic decline. So we saw this with the UK's Miller 2 decision. Absolutely, I think, shocking decision from the standpoint of many observers, in the sense that you have, courts in the UK who are fairly reluctant to involve themselves in these kinds of constitutional matters. But the court invalidates a prorogation of Parliament. One of the most quintessentially political acts under our Constitution, on the grounds that the prorogation had violated constitutional principle. I think we also have to think about, what happens to the relationships between our institutions when political actors decide that they're not going to uphold their responsibilities under the Constitution. I think it puts pressure on the courts to do more, and maybe go into places where they shouldn't be, frankly. But also at the same time, we can understand why, when we see the kind of erosion of fundamental constitutional principles, why the pressure exists for courts to expand their jurisdiction. So I'm actually going to stop there.
You've got 5 minutes
I'm
left.
good. I'm done. So I'll stop there and look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for inviting me here today, and thanks, Vanessa, for those great remarks. As was mentioned, I'm a journalist and a human rights activist who's had the privilege of working and advocating for some of the most important Russian pro-democracy and human rights activists over the past 15 years. Since 2007, I've been trying to warn Canadians about the Putin regime, its networks of proxies, and throughout the Western world and right here in Canada, and the threat that Russian information influence operations pose to our democracy. 10 years ago, I was in a cab in Ottawa with my friend and heroic Russian pro-democracy leader and human rights activist Boris Nemtsov when he received an urgent call. I'd invited Boris to Toronto and Ottawa to speak with Canadian and elected officials about the situation in Russia and Putin's growing populist authoritarianism and imperial ambitions. In the cab, Boris heard from his colleague in Moscow how Vladimir Putin had ordered the FSB to search the homes of Russian opposition leaders, including Nemtsov's, to find, or as it were, plant evidence in order to justify an arrest. As we drove into Ottawa and Putin's agents rifled through Nemtsov's apartment back in Moscow, he told me how important it is for countries like Canada to monitor and hold autocrats like Putin to account and to call out his regime's corruption and abuses. He believed that by actively standing up for democracy and its global advocates, Canada could help defend and protect champions of liberal democracy like and other vulnerable pro-democracy activists around the world. Applying sanctions on the Putin regime, holding it to account, and preventing corrupt Russian human rights abusers from exploiting Canada to hide their assets were Boris's key messages here in Canada. For his activism and leadership, Boris Nemtsov would pay the ultimate price. On February 27th, 2015, he was forever silenced, savagely gunned down with over 1,000 bullets just steps from the Kremlin. Unfortunately, it's taken several wars, tens of thousands of dead Georgian, Syrian, and Ukrainian civilians, millions of displaced people, and countless schools, hospital, homes, towns, and cities turned to rubble for much of the democratic world to finally recognize and acknowledge the nature of Vladimir Putin and the threat that he and his kleptocratic regime pose to global stability and the Western liberal democratic order. Now, over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to first talk about how Vladimir Putin has corrupted Russia, stamping out the post-Cold War progress Russia made towards becoming a liberal democracy, and how he's dragging his people back to a repressive crypto-Stalinist dictatorship. We'll then look at how Putin has aggressively exported his anti-democratic illiberalism and some of the populist autocrats he's aligned with, like Hungary's Viktor Orban. Finally, I'll try to how this represents a threat to Canadian democracy. Now, as a first-generation Canadian-born Estonian whose grandparents fled Soviet and Nazi terror in 1944, I spent much of my childhood advocating for the freedom of the Baltic states, Ukraine, and all other nations occupied and colonized by Soviet-era Russia. My community, as much as any other in Canada, truly hoped that we had reached the end of history, the failed KGB August coup in 1991, and the formal end to the Soviet occupation later that year. That hope for long-term peace and stability was short-lived for those who were paying attention to what was happening in Russia. In 1994, Estonia's first modern-era president, Lennart Meri, warned at a conference in Hamburg that the threat of Russian imperialism had not. The roots of Putin-era liberalism had already started to appear in Yeltsin's Russia. Imperial nostalgia and resentment manifested in language about Russia's right to dominate others within the former Soviet imperium. Meri warned that, quote, the West should make it emphatically clear to the Russian leadership that another imperialist expansion will not stand a chance. Just in case you missed it. Not a chance. Do you need a mute button there?
Yeah, there we go.
There we go, okay. Now, upon hearing Leonard Mery's warning, then Deputy Mayor of St. Petersburg, Vladimir Putin, got up and stomped out of the hall. Our failure to heed President Mery's early warnings and the many red flags over the past 30 years paved the way to our current, rather dangerous reality. When the Soviet regime began to collapse in the early 1990s, free political expression flourished after decades of repression. Cronyism and corruption, however, remained part of the post-Soviet hangover. Yeltsin's proposed constitutional reforms in 1993 triggered a violent confrontation that resulted in the deaths of 147 people. Yeltsin prevailed, and the new constitution consolidated power within the executive and paved the way for future autocrats to exploit these vulnerabilities. At the same time, the new oligarch class began buying up independent and recently privatized media, newspapers, radio, and television, and used that control to steer national public, most notably during the 1996 elections to help Boris Yeltsin overcome record low polling numbers to secure a final term in office. That election would be the last fully democratic one held in Russia. The Putin era started 4 years later on December 31st, 1999, after Boris Yeltsin chose the former KGB officer, Vladimir Putin, to succeed the popular and gregarious Boris Nemtsov. Putin's term began with a series of decrees, including the termination of a serious corruption investigation targeting the Yeltsin family and Putin himself. Within his first year in power, Putin ordered the FSB to investigate oligarchs who controlled Russian independent media. Boris Berezovsky, who owned Russia's Channel 1, faced charges of an embezzlement, a favorite used by the Putin regime to target opponents. After Berezovsky fled to the UK, the Kremlin quickly took control of Berezovsky's national media assets. Similar tactics were used to seize the media assets of Vladimir Gusinsky, who owned Russia's NTV and multiple newspapers and radio channels. With Russia's primary media under control, Putin set about weeding out any oligarchs who refused to support him. That same year, Putin invited Russia's top oligarchs to a meeting in the Kremlin where they were told that they could keep the wealth that they amassed during the privatization of the early 1990s so long as they stayed out of politics. Bill Browder, the head of the Global Magnitsky campaign, and others say that Putin issued an unpublished for 50% of their wealth and future revenues in exchange for their safety. One civic-minded oligarch who supported the development of Russian civil society and the pro-democracy movement, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, refused. Putin would make an example of Khodorkovsky by seizing his assets through a series of trumped-up charges. Khodorkovsky was arrested, and his company, Yuka, was sliced up and handed off to Putin's allies. Khodorkovsky was used to intimidate any other potentially independent-minded oligarchs into submission, and frankly, it worked. Activists, whistleblowers, journalists, and critics who exposed Putin's tactics were targeted with arbitrary arrests and assassinations. Former FSB agent Alexander Litvinenko, who exposed a Kremlin manufactured terrorist incident and a plot to assassinate Boris Berezovsky, was poisoned by Russian agents with radioactive polonium in a London hotel. One of the assassins, Alexander Lugvoy, was then appointed to the Russian Duma by Vladimir Putin as a reward for killing Litvinenko. Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya was gunned down in her apartment building in 2000 after exposing the atrocities committed by the Putin regime in its war against Chechen separatists. The string of mysterious deaths and violent assassinations continues today, with those who disagree with Putin. Those who disagree with Putin mysteriously falling out of windows. Critics living in the democratic world, including here in Canada, are also targets of Kremlin threats and intimidation. I have personal experience with this. All of this is intended to intimidate Putin's critics into silence. With Russian national media under his control and the oligarchs subdued, Putin set about manipulating Russian electoral laws to make it as difficult as possible for the democratic opposition to run against him in an election. Nomination thresholds for federal election candidates and parties were made impossibly high. Even when opposition that's collected enough signatures to run, Putin-appointed election oversight committees would dismiss submitted nomination packages. During elections at all three levels of government, opposition candidates, meaning non-United Russia candidates, face harassment and confiscation of election materials and even arrest. Putin loyalists threaten employees to ensure that they vote for United Russia. Other common methods of election fraud including ballot stuffing, bribery, tampering, and of course harassment. When Putin hit his term limit in 2008, he temporarily handed over the presidency to his close ally Dmitry Medvedev, who would act as a custodian for Putin until he could run for a third term in 2012. Unable to formally challenge or hold Vladimir Putin to account in the media or at the polls, politically independent and pro-democracy Russians had only one recourse: to take to the streets to protest and demand greater freedom and an end to corruption. Now, after a series of large protests in Moscow, authorities violently cracked down on them in May of 2012. Opposition leaders Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny were detained, along with dozens of others, and Russian punk rock band Pussy Riot faced years in prison for their musical protest. Russia's constitution had been amended without any meaningful opposition in 2008 to extend the presidential term from 4 to 6 years starting in 2012. And as Boris Nemtsov used to say, Putin was selected, not elected, to return to the presidency in 2012 for a term that would last until 2024. Putin's latest amendments to the Russian constitution in 2020 zeroed out his current term limits, extending the term to allow him to remain in office until 2036, when Putin would be 83 years old. Now, there's no reason to believe that he would not extend it again if he's still alive in 2030. Since 2012, Putin's repression of the democratic opposition has intensified. Boris Nemtsov was assassinated in 2015. His protege, Vladimir Kara-Murza, was poisoned later that year and again in 2017. He barely survived both and was arrested in April of last year for protesting Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Alexei Navalny was, of course, poisoned by the same FSB hit squad in 2020 and was jailed when he returned to Moscow in January of 2021. Protests that erupted following the arrest violently suppressed, as were those that followed Putin's special operation in Ukraine. Thousands of Russians are in prison today for protesting the regime. Democracy, freedom, and the truth are clearly toxic to Putin and his regime of kleptocrats. This is why Putin has committed to supporting like-minded, anti-democratic populist allies around the world. Indeed, it has become very difficult today to discern between far-left and far-right populism. They look identical in many ways. As Professor Lucan Way has stated, modern populism combines authoritarian nationalism with left-wing economic appeals. In Europe, Vladimir Putin has helped finance extremists on both the far right and far left in France, Italy, Greece, and Austria. Populist think tanks controlled by Putin and his associates have stretched their tentacles across Europe and even into Canada, co-opting former Canadian diplomats and academics who unwittingly or otherwise legitimize and normalize the Kremlin's corruption, repression, and aggression. It's no wonder that Hungary's populist far-right government announced last week that it would not provide military support for Ukraine and that Hungary would not allow Western military aid destined for Ukraine to cross its borders. Populists on both extremes of the political spectrum and authoritarians have studied Putin's playbook and have created their own alliance, which Anne Applebaum has dubbed Authoritarians, Inc. They share their knowledge, their strategies, and tactics through a network of state-funded think tanks and informal networks. In the democratic world, Viktor Orban became the poster boy for illiberal extremists, a more acceptable role model than Putin, although Fox News seems to be changing that. Orban's xenophobic, anti-elitist, anti-LGBTQ, and anti-Semitic views are tightly aligned with Vladimir Putin's and those of similar populist movements across the democratic world. Over the past 15 years, Orban has followed Putin's template, taking control of Hungary's media, through which his government promotes an aggressively populist agenda and polarizing narratives. He's exploited every opportunity to manipulate his country's constitution, even rewriting it to consolidate his power. Just as in Russia, Hungarian workers are intimidated by their managers to vote for the ruling Fidesz party. Extreme gerrymandering, including the ability to engage in voter tourism, allows Fidesz to transfer votes to districts where the opposition is competitive. And the absence of term limits ensures that Orban will likely remain in power for years to come. At the moment, it seems impossible for the opposition, 5 minutes, great, when they are united to pose any serious challenge to Orban's Fidesz. And Hungary is not alone. In Czechia, the former billionaire prime minister and current president candidate, Andrej Babiš, spent the past decade buying up Czech media in a bid to control the country's political narrative. After coming to power on an anti-immigration populist platform in 2017, Babiš politicized the judiciary after he was accused of corruption. As with most other European populists associated with association with Vladimir Putin is never far away. Babiš's close ally, Czech President Miloš Zeman, is a very close associate of Vladimir Putin. The links between Russia and Donald Trump were well documented in 2016. The consequences of that relationship reverberated through January 6, 2021, and continue to influence U.S. political life today. Tucker Carlson has become the Kremlin's favorite U.S. media personality for his daily whitewashing of Putin's atrocities in Ukraine. The emergence of far-left and far-right populism has been clearly visible in Canada too, as is the Kremlin's amplification, support, and alignment with them. During the COVID pandemic, we witnessed Russian state media offering a global platform for Canadian anti-lockdown, anti-government protesters and individuals within it who were calling for the overthrow of our democratically elected government during the Ottawa trucker protests. A far-right populist Ontario member of Parliament, Ontario Provincial Parliament, who supported the anti-lockdown and anti-vaccination movements and was interviewed by RT, went so far as to tell his Twitter followers that they should follow Russian state media for their news because RT wasn't afraid of reporting the truth. Russian state propagandists could not have been happier with that outcome. Finally, I should note that Canada's Parliamentary Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs recently acknowledged the threat of far-left and far-right populism in Canada and made a recommendation to continue to work to strengthen Canadian democracy, its institutions, and to ensure that its system is resilient to the challenges of today. It acknowledged the threat posed by foreign authoritarians. Meanwhile, the National Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliamentarians has repeatedly warned Canadians about the threat Russia poses to Canadians and our democracy. It is clear that the Kremlin has an interest in destabilizing our democracy by promoting extremism and populism right here at home. The liberal democratic world would have benefited from acknowledging President Medvedev's warnings about Russia in 1994, and those repeated by our Baltic, Polish, and Ukrainian allies since then. Today, the fight for democracy is being waged in towns like Bakhmut and cities like Kharkiv and Kiev by heroic Ukrainians who are the frontline protectors of the liberal democratic order. Ukraine's victory over Putin's authoritarian will also represent a defeat for political extremists and populists throughout the democratic world and right here in Canada. We must remain focused on supporting and helping Ukraine achieve that victory because, as Leon Trotsky said, we may not have an interest in war, but the war is very much interested in us. Thank you.
Over to you.
Great, very much, Marcus, Vanessa. I thought your last point was, I love that last statement that the war is very much interested in us, because a lot rides on it. Just as a little aside, during COVID, I was actually contacted at my house by CSIS that wanted to meet with me because my name had come up in Russian and Chinese, the people that they monitor in their network, because of course Poly can predict elections. And having a tool that can predict elections is very attractive to dictators, as it turns out. And so they actually told me, you might be one of the two Michaels if you were to go to Beijing. You would be arrested on trumped-up charges until you handed over the software. And there's a reason why we don't work with political parties at our organization, because we want independent. We don't want the AI used for that. We do commentary, of course, and we try to bring out the issues that Canadians are feeling. But very much what we want Poly to do is exactly that. Bring down the temperature in Canada, bring down the polarization by showing what normal people want to see. Not through the lens of their elected representatives who may or may not be normal, or the Chamber of Commerce and all those others. But let's hear directly. They're on social media, they're talking, we don't have to hear it through the filters. So as that introduction, I'm one of the co-founders of the company called Advanced Symbolics that has created this AI Poly. And her key innovation, she has a few key innovations. Number one, we are, for the first time, able to get a representative sample of people on social media. Up until now, you know, when you do regular market research, you're calling different postal code areas, so you get that mix of ethnicity and income and all of that so that you get a representative sample, because you can't talk to everybody. We weren't able to do that on social media because we don't have postal codes in social media. So it was really a 5-year research project out of the University of Ottawa. So Polly is also from the University of Ottawa. As a joint project between the people in social science and machine learning to bring about an AI, because the social science research wanted to be able to use social media for university research purposes. So that's where she was born. She also has, we have a whole bunch of patents. We've continued the research on keeping up the lexicon on social media, the memes and all of that, so we can make sure we're getting very accurate stuff. And then she uses generative text. This is a new product that's coming out in March. Up until now, it's been statisticians and university professors with her. We were part of the work that Doug Ford had for tracing COVID through Ontario during the pandemic. She would read the wastewater data and use her mobility algorithms to figure out, you know, if we've got this much COVID in Mississauga right now, how did those people move around the city in the last 2 weeks? So she's a lot of work in healthcare and stuff like that. But just to give you that comfort that the information is regularly, she is accurate at forecasting. There's even, for those of you interested in politics, TVO did a documentary in 2019 for the 2019 election, where we all had to give our predictions for the election ahead of the election. So Ipsos and Leger and ASI and 2 other AIs, and Polly was number 1 across the country. She got the election within 2 seats for the Liberals and 3 seats. So she didn't just say they're going to win a minority government. She said they're going to win, I think it was, what did they get in that election? 155 seats, and they got 153, something like that. And we said 118 for the Conservatives, was 121. So that's how precisely accurate she is, which is why we do our research through that. So I've put Polly to the test. David slowly sent me some questions. If we can, we'll switch over to our thing in a minute, and I'll show you how easy it is to ask Polly a question. We have early access now too, so people can go in and use Polly on their own. But before we do that, I wanted to, Vanessa talked about the protest law. I'm from Ottawa as well, so I have PTSD over the Freedom Convoy, and David had asked me a question about what is the next protest going to be? What are people protesting about on social media, right? Because that's where they start. So Joe, can we go to the PowerPoint slide? Because the protests was complex, there were a lot of dialogues on it, I've consolidated it all on a PowerPoint in the interest of time. So what should the next protest in Canada be about? This is what David wants to know. Now, it's hard to know a future thing but we're looking at, this is what people are talking about today, and we've ranked them. So the number we're saying about the subject of protest right now, there's 100,000 people talking about this, okay? So just under 100,000 in Canada. So of the people talking about it today, they want a protest to limit what is tolerated by protesters. 42%, and I thought this was so interesting because what they're saying is, yes, people have the right to protest, but do they have to block railroads, to cut off streets, to harass people in the street, to take over downtown cores? No, people are saying. So, and there's a lot of dialogue in there about, well, the police, it's up to the police to do this, and they're saying the police don't know, the government has not given them enough guidance as to what is, okay, so people have the right to protest. Do they have the right to lie across the railroad track or to take over downtown Ottawa? It's unclear, and people are saying they want politicians or whoever to make it clear what are the parameters for a protest. So if a politician were to stand up and say we need this, they would have the support of the population. People are tired of the way protests are being conducted. Number 2, a protest against the Freedom Convoy 2.0. Okay, a counter-protest was starting to ferment online, and perhaps the Freedom Convoy 2.0 people got a sense of that, because I think that it didn't go anywhere. The next one I think is really interesting because, so Polly, the way she works is she goes out, she's not tied to the word protest. She's looking at the tone of conversations. Do I find a conversation that looks like the others that might be a protest? And she's labeled Freedom to Read Week because it's there to protect intellectual and artistic freedom as a form of demonstration. Okay, so that it's a protest, if you will, for the oppression of intellectual and artistic freedom. That's something that comes up in March, and people are starting to talk about that. Al Jazeera and other foreign media influence on elections. People feel that they are rising up against that. They're saying that this is not Vladimir Putin hacking into the database and changing people's votes. They're saying this is very open, that there are ethnic media in the country, and that the ethnic media that are there have very strong political views. They are speaking directly to voters in Canada through that media, and people are talking about that online and saying, is this sort of like political advertising, you know, but it's in the media. But they don't find that it's unbiased, which we'll get to in a minute. And then a protest to stand up to protect Canada's history, 5.2%. These are people who feel that the dismantling of, say, Ryerson, or changing the name of Ryerson, or removing Sir John A. Macdonald and things like that we need to be doing more to stand up for our history. Now, if we look at the demographics, you'll see it's very polarized how people feel this way. This is limits to what is tolerated by protesters. You'll see now, if you're below the red line, means you're underrepresented in that area. So there's only 3 provinces where we see that we need limits to what protesters are allowed to do. Quebec is way overrepresented in this, and which I find funny because we always see them as protesting all the time, right? But it's not against protesting, it's against what's tolerated when you're protesting. So Quebec, way overrepresented in this. The prairies also overrepresented. Now they look smaller just because there's fewer people in the prairies. That's why the red line is there, to say it's more than you would expect from the prairies. Ontario, underrepresented in that view, despite the fact that most of these protests are happening here. So, but I think that's where people are polarized in, do they have the right? Do you want to put limits on protesters? Ontario is a little bit polarized that way. But Quebec is very clear, we need limits on protesters. When we look at against the Convoy, it's young people overrepresented in their opposition to the Freedom Convoy. Maybe because they were most impacted by, they're living downtown, they're all of that kind of thing. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see, to deep dive. Reading League for Intellectual and Artistic Freedom, I thought it would be the other way, but overrepresented in men. Al Jazeera is exclusively the prairies. So I don't know what's going on there. It would, again, if you're a researcher, we call Polly the AI for unbiased research because she has no agenda. She is just looking very plainly at what people are seeing. Maybe there's something going on in the prairies, don't know. Stick Up for Canadian History, Alberta, probably not surprising, but hugely overrepresented. So again, knowing that this is happening and that it's a good opportunity to go in and address that where it becomes angry. And then Stick Up for History is evenly split between male and female. But it's a young person's thing, and 55 to 64, perhaps their teachers, parents, what have you. What this looks like to me is young people are learning about Canadian history, and just as they're learning about it, it's becoming dismantled. There seems to be a lot of teachers who teach Canadian history or who are not happy about the Canadian history, and they're imparting that to young people. So I thought that was really interesting. Maybe we haven't done enough work to explain to teachers why this is happening, or to have a dialogue, right, about that. Because the next generation risks being scarred a little bit by that. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background on that particular question that David had asked. Can we switch to my laptop now? So this is, I'm going to show you just how easy it is to ask a question of Polly. You just pick your country. I've picked Canada. Does anybody have a question on the Unwritten Constitution that you would like to ask Canadians? Yes?
So what do they think of the idea that political decisions should be decided by a majority rather than a minority? We have that legislation now in Ontario that basically says municipalities mostly in the Greater Toronto area can pass laws with a third of the votes of those elected to those municipal councils.
Okay.
So what does Polly think of that?
So should I ask, should municipalities be able to, or what's the bill called?
Well, It's Bill 39.
Okay.
It's called the Better Municipal Government Act, believe it or not.
Okay,
But in fact, the question is,
with the mind.
should democracies make decisions according to the majority rather than by the minority? I mean,
Okay.
that's the big question in Ontario that nobody here has yet talked about, but it seems to be, it has something to do, I think, with constitutional norms. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
Okay, so that's what I put in. I know it's hard to see probably, but I wrote, should democracies make decisions according to the majority rather than minority?
Yeah.
Okay, and then I'm gonna press send. So that's how you ask it. Now, unfortunately, we did a huge data, we rapidly, greatly increased the number of documents that Polly looks at because we've added a whole bunch of new social media platforms. So she's taking 10 minutes right now. By February 1st, she'll be back in seconds. But while we're waiting for her to grok through that, I thought we would go through some of the things that I put together while I was, in preparation for coming here that we could look at. One of them, again, David had asked me, how much do we have left-wing extremism? How much do we have right-wing extremism? I was looking at those, but it got really kind of convoluted. You can imagine they're all arguing with each other. One of the things that came up was centrism, and centrism is lost in Canada. So I decided to just do a search on centrism. Is centrism in decline? And I got more people talking about that than left or the right. So I'm just going to, it'll come up hopefully in a second. Here we go. So I got 407,000 people on that topic. And here are some of the conversations, 27 conversations. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. Usually I don't see more than 10. When I have more than 10 conversations on something, that's a bit of a flag to me, especially with a high participation, that this is fermenting and could become a big issue, okay? So the first one that came up is the movement farther right and disappearance of a centrist party in Canada is begging for attention. I'll click that. So he says, it's interesting that not long ago there was 2 centrist parties in Canada, and now we're asking for just one. Okay, so and then this one, the Alberta Party is taking advantage of a shifted political spectrum. The NDP is far left and UCP is conservative to feign centrism. Part of the Liberal strategy last election was what was called a leap to the left of the NDP, and the only way centrism led to Trump's election is because he was a longtime Democrat who ran for the Republican Party because the Democrats had moved too far to the left. So they're saying, people in Canada are saying that it's politicians becoming polarized is causing the population to become polarized. Here he says Canada is neither true conservative nor too left. Most Canadians are centrists and our governments should hug the center. Okay, so these are so Polly is, what she does is she goes out to 400,000 people, she clusters the conversations, and she summarizes the clusters that she sees. So she's taking 10,000 people's conversations and trying to summarize it. Now, those of you who were here last month, or in November, saw that Polly had a bit of a potty mouth because she was reflecting how people talked on social media.
We were obscene.
We were obscene, so we took Polly back we gave her a spank. Oh, that's obscene too. We took her back to school and we told her, you read social media, then you have to go read a journalism corpus, so like the Globe and Mail and the New York Times, and then write your stuff. But sorry about this, Marcus, but then she became really boring, okay? It was, and it was like, oh, this is, because we're trying to get public opinion here, not like really sort of vanilla. So then we said, okay, let's put her onto columnists, right? Because then they have like a point of view. Because people on social media have a point of view. We need to pull that out. That's where you're getting the I and she and John said, so we're trying to get that out because she's summarizing 10,000 people, not one person. So that's why you see, so it's a work in progress. We're trying to make her polite, not boring, and not obscene. Okay, so that's a tall order for an AI. Just as a little interesting aside, with an AI, you have to train it like a child. Positive reinforcement. You don't say don't do this. Copy that person. Okay, that's how AIs work. And there's, you'll see too in a lot of criticisms of AI, oh, they're always copying people. That's how AIs learn. They copy us. So you want them to copy us and not, other machines, okay? So there's 27 conversations here, but they're all really about this fundamentally, that we need a party, and some people are advocating for, could the centrists and all the different parties come together and make a new centrist party? Because it is the politicians leading the way to getting people polarized by not having anything else that we can vote for. If I look here, how are Canadian judicial appointments different from American? Obviously, there's quite a bit of difference, but judges in Canada are appointed rather than elected to safeguard the independence. For a U.S. president to appoint Supreme Court justice than it is for a Canadian prime minister. Some surprising facts on Canadian judicial appointments: 100 federally appointed judges, half women, 4 Indigenous, self-identifying as member of a visible minority population. So that's the majority of people talking about that. It's really important. What this is saying is it's really important to people that the judiciary be diverse. You got almost 70% of people saying the good thing about appointing judges and not electing them is that you can make sure you've got what you need on the bench. And to the earlier point, you're not, it's not just the majority choosing. And that's almost 100,000 people talking about that. Another interesting one that I thought in this one here, Canadians concerned with American political and judicial misdemeanors, do you even know who's on the Supreme Court of Canada or the process involved in appointing judges? I have to laugh at Canadian media that badmouths the U.S. way of appointing Supreme Court judges. There are at least they are vetted in public and their appointment is debated. In Canada, they're appointed by a PM that has absolutely no training in law, known to have no ethics. Okay, this is not my opinion, this is people on more. And elected government no longer decide what Canadians want. And so, and that's sort of 1.1%. Yeah, it's small. And as I was saying earlier, when you get these small discussions, sometimes it's like, yeah, why don't we televise at least these judges, because maybe then we'll get to know them better and know what their politics are and stuff like that. Oh, okay, so I got to go quickly. Okay, so thank you. So some of the other things that I saw that I thought were interesting are the courts failing us? Sorry, but it takes a bit of time to load because there's a lot of... the court system is failing to provide justice to victims. Okay, so first of all, there's 384,000 people, so 385,000 people talking about this, with 23 conversations. Again, very polarizing. The court system failing to provide justice to victims is a significant crime is up so much in the GTA. The courts failed to apply the law fairly here, so judges involved need to be named and their judgments reviewed, all that kind of stuff. Here, we need to prioritize education. Okay, hold on. So here, government, not legislation, has failed provincial court judges. Officials present have shown a lack of respect for the importance of the process. Failing to appoint Supreme Court judge that reflects the diversity of Canada is not a merit-based system. And then Abella says the rule, and this is coming from a Supreme Court judge, says the rule of law in Canada is failing. She says the courts are not independent of Parliament or the executive. So this is people feeling that the courts are not independent enough of Parliament and that they're under, and I saw quite a bit of that, especially when we were looking at the Jody Wilson-Raybould stuff and all of that kind of stuff.
We asked Rosie to be with us today, but she's still at Harvard.
Oh, okay.
She'd like to be noticed, but Polly knows her.
And then I had one that, yeah, let her know that. She needs to come next time. Polly's talking about her. All right, is the Charter of Rights ignored in Canada? And Quebec started down the road, so a lot of concern about provinces, Quebec and Ontario, Ford Nation overriding for their political ends. So we see a lot of that. It's supposed to protect Canadians, especially from politicians. This one here, today marks the 38th anniversary of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I continue to fight discriminatory building policy in new housing that ignores Section 15. There is no use of the notwithstanding clause. The question is if the federal government will disallow not even used since 1943. So people saying that they're not allowed to, they're not using the notwithstanding clause for things that really matter. They're using it for their political ends. One of the things that came up, and I won't go in through it here because it takes a while to load. One of the questions I asked are, do religious groups influence the courts? Because that's, of course, what we're seeing in the United States. I thought it was really interesting. People were saying, in fact, it's the opposite in Canada, that the court has only ruled in favor of religious rights 40% of the time, and that whenever somebody else's rights go up against religious rights always lose. So they use the example of during COVID, when churches were saying people need to be able to come into church, we'll space them out, we'll do all this, the churches lost, and they said that violated freedom of religion. They say whenever there's a case of a church doesn't want to marry, say there was a case of people not wanting to marry LGBTQ or whatever, and it ruled against the church. And so there's a lot of discussion online about religious rights, and is it the opposite in Canada than it is in the United States?
Maybe we could go back to the question that was posed.
Oh, yeah.
And wrap up.
Yeah, let's see if we're there, if it's come up. Where is it? Should democracies make decisions according to the majority? See, it's not quite finished yet. So we'll come up to it maybe at the end of the panel. Okay?
Okay.
Great.
Yes, we can come back to
Oh,
that.
it's here. It's here. Democracy is majority rule with respect to the rights of minorities. Here in Alberta, we have gang rule by lawless thugs. Okay. I haven't had a chance to review this, so. But here, privileged majority rule is dangerous in this moment when that majority are relatively safe, and it is the equity-seeking minorities that are ever more vulnerable. So that is the number one thing, 52%. In democracy, minority rights are not decided by polls, and suggested a premier should defend the rights of, this is Quebec again, not only the majority. Government should not rule by fear as a tool. So government, if the people should be about each other, not the majority, but all minorities according to the law. In democracy, a minority should not win a majority. That's elections. Liberal democracy is much more than just the rule of the majority. It is founded on the rights of individuals and minorities, as well as the rule of law, are protected by the independent courts. So we probably would have had to get right into that bill to focus on that, because you've got almost 300,000 people about this, over 10 questions. A minority cannot force anything the majority to do. But the majority thing is that privileged majority rule is dangerous. That is the main thing that people are saying. So they do want to see more minority rights, but it's not in particular about your question. So in cases like that, you would take this, read them all, and then try rephrasing it with the bill, because I do find often people do state the Polly is able to see people who are, even if they don't state the bill, talking about that issue.
Question.
Okay.
It seems as though that the question Polly was answering was, should you protect minority rights?
Yeah.
Well, sorry, that's not the question at
Yeah.
all.
It's just in how you phrase it. Yeah.
We also, ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions, we have a mic which we need for the television audience, for the YouTube. So
Okay.
please speak
Well,
to the mic if you have a
let
question.
me first of all just thank the panel for their presentations, and then we'll segue into. Thank you. Again, a diverse set of perspectives. The first two were particularly chilling, I thought, but we'll now segue into the question period for those who are here, and then perhaps any that have come in online in a few minutes. So are there questions from the floor? Yes, at the back. And if we could get a mic down there, please.
So the opening remarks stressed about the tensions in our society, different groups opposing left and right, populist, non-populist, and so on. Has your organization, asked Polly, asked the question whether Canadians are concerned about class conflict and what that might give rise to?
Yes, well, I haven't asked class conflict, and I can put that in there. I did do a lot of it on left wing, right wing, and there's huge amounts of conversation about that. And people are concerned, in fact, that it's not really classes. What I'm seeing is that there's a feeling that leaders are people toward class conflict, and that the majority of Canadians are cognizant of that. They feel the politicians are divisive, and they feel that a lot of that happened during COVID, where it was using divisiveness to get votes. And people are very in tune with that, and that's why people are calling for a new political party where the less divisive people come together and make a new party. That's the conversation, what I'm seeing right now, that Canadians are actually tired of pitting people against each other.
Would either Vanessa or Marcus like to comment on that as well? I know it was specifically on poly, but...
I mean, sure. I guess I can comment from a sort of a foreign perspective and foreign interference. I mean, polarization is exactly the outcome that Black and others like him are looking for in places like Canada and the democratic world. Russian state media has become expert at identifying the most divisive issues in our society and actually sinking its fangs into it and pulling both towards the left and the right. So Vladimir Putin has no real ideology other than to polarize us, and through that destabilize our democracy. So we've seen a lot of this happening over the past, I'd say decade or so. The research that we've done with through Disinfo Watch, which is an organization that I founded a couple of years ago, research that we did last year demonstrated that Russian state media actually mentioned Canada, Canadian, and issues of Canadian interest nearly 10,000 times over about a 3 year in tweets that were deleted by Twitter. These were accounts that were controlled by the Russian government. So the Russian government has very much taken an interest in Canadian issues. And like I said, what it does is tries to polarize us on those issues. And we saw during COVID that there were individuals, certainly on the far left and the far right, who further amplified those narratives, and that the Russian state also legitimized.
It's interesting, I didn't get to the media bias, but people are asking, are there organizations that randomly check stories on media in Canada and report whether or not they're biased or not? That's another thing that people are really wanting to see, is some sort of reportage, unbiased reportage on the media.
Only to say quickly that I think this tool and questions that you're asking are really informative, because to me they open up sort of alternative narratives, right, about what it is that citizens want, and frankly, what citizens want is actually pretty heartening in many ways, right? And I think there's going to be some discussion later, I think, about the importance of civics education, and inculcating a democratic culture in our society. And I think this very much points to the importance of those things and the ways that we have to challenge these narratives of division and polarization. Anyway, it's from a research perspective, it's really interesting findings.
Cool. At this point, I'm exercising massive self-restraint because I really want to leap into this conversation. But we have other...
Yes. I think my question is about poly, and building on what Vanessa just said, but how much can we use poly? Have you seen a decline in the number of users of social media? Some conversations are that people are using it less, that Twitter is falling apart, that there's a class of people that continue to use Facebook constantly, but that there are a large group that are actually disengaging a little bit or using different. So my question is, you've been at it for a few years now.
Yeah.
What's the overall group? Is it getting bigger? Is it getting smaller? Do you know whether it's a group that is the constant users, or they, so what's the limit of your tool in a way?
Yeah, no, great question. So two things. We still are able to get representative samples on all the platforms. So in this tool, we're using TikTok, Twitter, and Reddit. We can use any social platform, but we find those ones are the best for getting people to speak honestly. People on Facebook, it's fake book, right? Like, oh, I'm the best, my kids are wonderful. But the reason, the important part is that's why you have to sample. We have noticed for sure that before Elon Musk, the more extremists, and we want the extremists, we're going to other platforms, so we went to other platforms too to find them. You have to keep them in balance, okay, so that they're like 5% of the population, but they're still important. So that's why you want to make sure that you are getting a representative sample, because if you just randomly look at keywords, you will be overrepresented in people who talk a lot, right? What we do is 300,000 people that represent Canada, not because they talk a lot, we start with the people. They might not even be talking about these issues. That's why we show you what percentage, because not everybody's talking about it. They're chosen for their normalcy, so we have all sorts of algorithms in place for making sure that these are normal people. And that they're not bots and all of that. Average people, maybe not normal, but average, like they're average Canadian, followers and all of this kind of stuff. We do have journalists and we do have superstars and all that, but in proportion. If you don't sample properly, you will be overrepresented by the loudmouths, and who are usually extremists. And you are also open to bots and things like that. So that's why you have to start with the people, investigate them closely, and then move from there.
Okay. I'm going to take one question online, and then we'll come back to in person. Okay.
And it'll be.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So have, excuse me, have you heard of author Jonathan Manthorpe or his 2018 book, Claws of the Panda? Oh yes, Claws of the Panda. And does anyone, Marcus, maybe you want to comment on that, or either of the others?
Well, sure. I mean, I can comment very quickly. I was with joined Jonathan Manthorpe on a panel last year. He does write about the influence of the Chinese government and the Chinese state media in the Chinese and Asian diaspora here in Canada. And so one of the things that the Russians do very well is to manipulate narratives, news, social media. The Chinese government doesn't do that very well. But what the Chinese government does very well is intimidate its own diaspora, whether it's in Canada or elsewhere. And it intimidates it and in attempts to control it and to influence it to whether it's during an election period or on specific issues. And it does this through direct intimidation of that diaspora. It also uses local diaspora media to inject narratives into the Chinese-speaking community here in Canada. So yeah, it's a very serious issue. It's come up over and over again. We certainly saw in the last federal election, the federal election before that there were attempts at Chinese influence, the Chinese government seeking to influence the outcome of that election. And of course, there are now reports of these Chinese police stations or Chinese government police operating right here in Canada. I live in Markham. Apparently, there are two right there. We're in Markham. We're sort of ground zero for that sort of influence operation, and the Canadian government really does, I think, need to start taking a serious look at this to protect the Chinese-speaking community here in Canada, because they are under threat, and we have to recognize that. I think the Chinese government would prefer to position as any Canadian government efforts to protect the diaspora as being anti-Asian. They're not. We need to protect the rights of that diaspora to speak and think as freely as possible and make free political decisions.
I've got to talk to you, because we did some work just after the George Floyd stuff to see if racial stuff with police. And we started in Ottawa, okay? We expect to see that if racialized groups had a problem with police, it'd probably be the black community, that's your thesis going in. In Ottawa, it was the Chinese community criticizing the police. So we thought, oh, that's kind of unexpected. Never hear about that. Never heard of any issue. So then we decided, just as a point of comparison, let's do this across Canada. In every city in Canada, the racial group that was complaining most about the police was Chinese. And I thought that was really interesting, and so I'd love to talk to you about it. I did mention it to some people at the time, and they said, well, yeah, this is the Chinese government issue, trying to get polarization. It's let's complain about police brutality and stuff like that, but it's not coming from the group you'd expect. So.
Interesting.
Very interesting. This conversation also could go a while, but I think we'll take one more question now in person. And we've got, yes, if you could give this gentleman the mic, please.
A few weeks ago, we lost a great thinker, Professor David Smith. Yeah, some of you know him. One of you? Two of you. And David wrote eloquently on all matters and about politics. He's a wonderful guy, but especially around the Crown and its invisibility. In Canada, no one's addressed the role of the Crown in this discussion, which I think is an incredible Canadian blind spot. So I'm challenging you. I don't want an answer. It'll take, but I do want to prompt you to think about it. We could say that the college was founded by a gentleman whose biography was written by Professor Bissell, the Imperial Canadian. We could note that the visitor is Her Honor Elizabeth Dowdeswell. We know that there's a very strong constitutional respect for the monarchy, and we know that the Lieutenant Governor signs every law into effect in Canada. This is not a minor thing, and of course the appointments, as was pointed out earlier by the Prime Minister, to the courts and to this position are very, direct the country in a very profound and useful way. So, David's work about the invisible crown, and here we are in Massey College with the invisible crown yet again. So I just wanted to throw it out to you, gifted thinkers, for a response in writing tomorrow morning.
I could say something
David
brief.
Smith was actually in our Massey forums pre-COVID.
Wonderful.
But that's
I should only say that I know David's work well, since a large part of my work concerns the executive branch of state. And I have a paper I could send you that probably reflects some of my thoughts on where, if we're talking about where the vice-regal, the Governor General might sit on this, or a Lieutenant Governor, where they're implicated. I mean, my sense certainly is that those pressures that I talked about at the end of the presentation, that, if politicians start playing fast and loose with constitutional rules, that we're more likely to see courts step in. I think it would be a mistake to hope that a Governor General or a Lieutenant Governor would also step in those circumstances. I think we are moving farther away from, rather than closer to that, as an appropriate kind of response for our constitutional order. Often, in the aftermath of constitutional crises, there's often a discussion about the role of the Governor General. I have a colleague, Adam Dodek, who suggested that, the Governor General should start to issue, public reasons for, for adopting a particular approach, granting a prorogation, for example, in a controversial context. I'm against that. I'm against further, enhancing the power of vice-regal officers. I think that we're better to look to courts in an emergency, in an urgent situation, and even they are not, when it comes to the political constitution, we need political actors and the civil society to take responsibility for this, rather than, hoping courts will sort of breach the limits of their jurisdiction to save us. That is a measure of last resort, and not not an optimal one often, but that, you know, the Governor General is even further removed in my sense in terms of who we want engaging on these issues.
I wasn't really thinking of engagement or salvific transition for the vice-regal or regal positions. But the governor, Lieutenant Governor here, whose name escapes me, the Don, to pontificate on issues all the time, because he just was that kind of person. And after his vice-regal position was over, he went and got elected as a Conservative member of Parliament in Ottawa, which he didn't like, because of course no one cared about him at that point. I've forgotten his name, but you can see his portrait over there. But I'm not at all arguing for more promulgations, but I am saying that they appear small in a multicultural city the size of Toronto, but in the rural areas, when the Lieutenant Governor comes, it's an event. It always has been.
It is with great reluctance that I draw this particular panel to a close. I think there are any number of ways we could take this conversation, the role of the Crown in a liberal democracy, the contesting narratives that are buffeting our institutions, the role of AI in not only observing but participating in the public conversation, any number of directions. It's been a rich panel. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And we'll have a short break now?
Yeah,
Yes.
come back at 11.
Back at 11.
That's fascinating software that you have.
Yeah. Whoops.